All right, so would you guys like to talk about why you think checks for understanding is important?
Brett.
All right, yeah, can y'all hear me? All right, so checks for understanding are important because, I mean, the whole purpose of SI is to facilitate like those light bulb moments essentially and like learning with your students. And checks for understanding are just checking to make sure that they're actually like comprehending and like learning and being able to apply the different things that you've covered in session.
Does anyone else have anything to add on to that? All right, so personally, I feel like it's very important to prioritize your students' learning, which is why we apply checks for understanding. And this can look a lot different from whether you're using checks for understanding to simply do it because you're told to do it as a facilitator and you want to check that off of your list of things you've done in that session. I think it's a lot more effective when you view your students' understanding as like, okay, this is my friend and I really want to make sure they're understanding something so that they can recall it better on the exam. I think when you are thinking about checks for understanding in that way, checks for understanding also comes a lot more naturally rather than relying on your planning sheet the whole time, which also makes it less stressful when you're planning to make sure that you get to everything you plan for, because I personally don't really get to everything I plan for because I have so many other checks for understanding that I can use to accommodate for my students. And they usually come naturally throughout session according to what they're understanding, how they're understanding it, and how they'd like to understand it. And I think the main thing with checks for understanding is also that it allows students to make connections and tie everything in their notes together, because oftentimes, or not oftentimes, in all classes, everything they learn in the class is in one way or another connected to each other. So sometimes I even like to think back to things that are from unit 1 and I bring them in and I'm like, what did you learn about this in unit 1 and how can we apply that now? That's more of a how, but I think it really ties this together. And I did write here about how checks for understanding is very important for the other two elements, but that goes the other way. I think the other elements are very important for checks for understanding, and checks for understanding is important when you're using the other elements. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right, so now we can talk about the how for checks for understanding. How do you guys like to apply checks for understanding in your sessions? You can recall specific moments when you've applied checks for understanding and thought it was very useful. Are there specific types of questions that you ask your students when they're maybe not understanding something, or you really want to make sure that they are understanding something?
I'd say one way that I use checks for understanding is like sometimes I'll get a different student to explain what a student just did on the board, like have them put it into their own words, or just ask them like maybe why we use a certain process of like solving something, or just asking them for like a why behind what they just did. So
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think why is often the most useful checks for understanding you can use when you can't think of another checks for understanding, but also just in general, I think it's very important. Would anyone else like to add anything?
Yeah, I'm sorry about like my cat guys, but for checks for understanding, I know when I facilitated, I always got to see the tests that my students would get. So I would look at the test, and when I was planning my checks for understanding, I would try to ask them questions that were kind of similar to the questions they would be asked. Like if your professor uses a lot of application questions or short answer, trying to get them to think in that way was really helpful for my students.
All right, those were great. So I'm not going to focus too much on the how right now, just because I get more into it later. But I think it's very important to first understand the why before you can move on to the how, because again, you don't want to view checks for understanding as sort of like just something you want to get over with. You really want to make sure that your students are understanding the material. So something I added on here that I like to use, because I know we're told that we're not supposed to ask them yes or no questions, which is why I wanted to add this on here, because I use yes or no questions a lot, but I always follow it up with something they can elaborate on. So if I ask my students whether or not they understand something, the first time I ask them, they might say, yeah, I do understand. And then I'll ask them, okay, can you explain it? And then it'll turn out that they don't understand it. But then the next time I ask them, do you understand something? They'll say, no, I don't understand it, which allows them to be a lot more open with you and a lot more, I guess, expressive about their understanding, which is very useful in the long run. When if they don't understand something, they'll be more open about it from the jump start. And then the fill in the blanks, it's probably my favorite way to make connections. Like I said, I feel like checks for understanding is very useful for helping them making connections in their notes. And I think this can look like, depending on whatever question they've just answered, you can say, okay, and that is important because, which helps them put the two, like the what it is and then the why, it helps them put that together. And then that's how they make the connections between the notes, or that's how I make sure they're making those connections. Does anyone have anything else to say now about the how? All right, so I have a scenario for you guys. I'll read it off and I just want you guys to think about what you would do if this was happening to you. So you are reviewing vocabulary terms with your biology students. These are the words: hypothesis, experiment, correlation, and photosynthesis. The activity you guys are doing involves writing each word on one side of a flashcard and passing the flashcards around so that every student has gotten a chance to write something on each flashcard. At the end, you ask the students to present the flashcard they were left with. You notice that a student is reading directly from the flashcard, suggesting they do not feel confident enough in the material to elaborate in their own words. How would you incorporate checks for understanding to make sure your student feels more confident about the material? So I can give you guys a few or a minute or two to think about this, and then you guys can discuss. So would anyone like to share what they would do in this scenario? Maybe specific questions you might ask the student?
I will also remind everyone, active participation is expected and bi-weekly, and we are not going to be rude to Laraib by not actively participating in the presentation that she has spent a lot of time preparing for us. So we need to see some more participation, please.
I know in my sessions, if at least because I do math, and so if I have students who are just reading off what they write on the board or anything, I'll ask them after that to take what they just said and without looking at the board, or in this case, looking at the flashcard, tying everything that they just said together.
Another
Right.
thing that you could possibly do would be to ask them not just to explain like what's on the flashcard, but also like how everything ties together, not just with like the ones that are on the flashcards, but with everything that you've been talking about in class so far, and just see all the interconnectedness of that and how that relates back to the class.
Yeah, so both of the things that you guys said are very similar to what I would do. So I feel like when you are applying checks for understanding, it's very important to consider other aspects, such as some things I like to consider is like students specifically, what works better for them, or what time of the semester it is, or how close we are to the exam. So if it's earlier on in the semester, I wouldn't really call that one student out. I would just I would just redirect that or that discussion to the rest of the students so that we can talk about it as a group, and then I'll come back to that student. So to focus on something specifically, if that student had the word hypothesis, I wouldn't similar to what Brett just said, I would bring other things into the conversation so that they can really make that full circle in their notes, like they can really make those connections and come back to the hypothesis, and then they'll have a lot better understanding of what they're talking about. So some questions I might ask them are, what step is the hypothesis in the scientific method? What can we infer from this being an earlier step? What even is the scientific method? And what are the steps before and after this step? And at this point, when you're asking them these questions, you'll notice that they are using their notes a lot more, because they're like, okay, I remember this, I remember the word scientific method. And then they'll go to that word in their notes. Sorry, guys. And they'll find hypothesis, and then they can really, when they're redirecting themselves, they can really read what's under hypothesis, and then they'll find all the other steps under there, and then they can really make those connections. And then when you go back to the student who was struggling to put it into their own words, then they'll have such a better understanding of what they were talking about, and they can really show that they really understand the material now. So yeah, the last thing I wrote on here was applying checks for understanding unconsciously, which really goes back to the why, my why of checks for understanding, which is making sure that you're not just focusing on questions, because you might not have planned for your student not knowing what hypothesis was in your planning sheet. So you really need to come up with those on the spot. And accommodate for each student again, like I said before, and what works better for them. And you can even accommodate for the situation like this. I accommodated when I redirected to the whole group rather than asking that specific student. Does anyone have any questions about that?
Something that I shared yesterday in Gainesville was like with this scenario in particular, like having them, you know, they're spending the time making the cards, and then almost if I was like planning this, I would almost like plan another activity as a checks for understanding of like having them partner up and play heads up, so you can see if that one student who was having trouble, like, you know, they were just reading the words off the card, if they can then explain that card well enough to the other person to be able to get the other person to understand like what word they're trying to describe. So that's another way of like checking understanding without necessarily just asking questions.
I do also think when students are struggling with something in specific, you can bring like that information back later on in like the next activity and really just help them recall the information as much as they can during that session so that they can remember it on the long run, like I said. So does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, I love that you've just brought that up because that's so important that the session flows, you know, even if there's different content, different activities, but that by the end, the final check for understanding in the closing is the goal. It should accomplish your goal for the session and really draw everything together. So there's always a chance to keep checking for understanding, even from something that was discussed in the opening or the main one activity by the end of session.
That's excuse me, that's a good point, because I think we always like looking back and connecting it to our overall goal for session and our overall check for understanding. At the end of the day, like we always want our students to leave feeling like they know, focusing more on what they know rather than like what they don't know. And so being able to kind of bring it back to like, okay, tell me what you do know, and helping them work kind of work backwards to figure out what they know and to focus in on that to help them get to where they need to be, I think is key here, especially when you're talking about that final checks for understanding, like being able to say, okay, remember, like this might not make a lot of sense right now, but this is the foundation that you're working with. And through my, like everything that I'm doing in session is helping you like strengthen that foundation so that then you can focus on that to learn this new concept. Even if it's not 100% in session, you'll be able to focus on what you do know, focus on the foundations to get you there. And the next session we'll keep building, And I think all of these like checks for understanding really support that in my opinion.
Sorry, I want to add one more thing too. Sarah made me think of this. The important thing, I think, when planning for checks for understanding, and many of you have heard me say this when I observe you, is not just listing a bunch of questions, but literally asking yourself, so you thinking critically as you plan, how will I know that my students know this? So like Laraib has planned, you know, I will know if take this scenario and think about those scenarios when you're planning, but like, I will know when all the students can read the note cards, can repeat the information without reading the note card. That's one way you will know that they've got a check for understanding. And then, yeah, planning out these types of questions. So it's not just planning for questions, it's definitely thinking about bigger picture. How will I know as the guide and the facilitator of this learning, that they have gotten the material.
Sorry. I think with that, also focusing in on the critical thinking piece of it too. It's not just like, can they recite these facts? Can they recite this information? But like Laraib said multiple times, and that's my biggest thing, is the connections. Is not only can they recite this information, can they recite what's on the note card, but can they take it one step further and talk about how hypothesis relates to experiment, and how experiment relates to photosynthesis, and how, I'm forgetting the other word. I'm so sorry, Laraib, but like how all of these things relate to each other. Like the words that I've chosen when I'm planning are not just random. They all they're in the same like chapter, they're in the same section, they're in the same content. So they're working with each other. So can my students also do that? Can they put everything together? That's where the critical thinking piece comes in. And that's where the actual learning of the material, understanding the material takes place. Yeah, that's a really good point, Lauren.
I don't think, did Lauren say something? I don't think I heard anything.
Sorry, she said, I know a lot of times students will memorize things off the PowerPoint slides, so knowing how they connect as a big picture is very important as a check for understanding.
Yeah, I think those were all some very great points. And I do want to highlight here, notice how when even when Sarah and Emily were talking about the scenario, there was a lot of incorporation of the other elements, which really builds my point that you can't really escalate checks for understanding without applying wait time and redirection. So when I redirect it to the whole group, or when I ask these questions, I'm kind of redirecting them to their notes. And also when I ask these questions, I would have to apply wait time to know how they're feeling about each one of these questions before they can redirect themselves. So yeah, you can't really apply one element without applying the other elements. Which is also why I want to say, just because I talk about checks for understanding more in this biweekly does not mean it's more important. I just feel like there's a lot more I can say about checks for understanding, or like there's just in general a lot more to say about checks for understanding, whereas redirection and wait time are kind of just self-explanatory. They're whys and just what they are in general. So we'll move on to redirection. Redirection is when you just redirect the students to another resource if they're not like if they answer a question, or if even when they ask a question, you want to first make sure they can find the answer themselves before either you give them the answer. But honestly, my last resort is always Google before I have to give them the answer. I try to never give my students the answers and make sure they really get it themselves. I might clarify it at the end if they answer the question and there's something I might want to add on to that, but I don't really answer my students' questions. I always redirect, which is very important because you don't want your students to be dependent on you. And I did write reinforcing a collaborative learning environment, which is one of the main goals of SI sessions. You want to make sure everyone is talking with each other. So when you redirect the conversation to the whole group, that's when you're reinforcing that learning environment or collaborative learning environment. So now I'm going to have you guys talk again about why you think redirection is important.
I think it's important because it kind of, well, it takes you out of being like the middleman in like session between like them answer and them, but it also like helps build their own confidence of being able to, like, if they're working on their homework at home, to go and be able to find that answer and not have to rely on somebody else to help them find it. So
Another thing that can come from redirection is it's not necessarily related to the content that they learn, but it's something that I've noticed in sessions is if I redirect students to each other a lot, then they typically will, or well, I've observed this in my the bio class SI for this semester. Some of the students that I redirected to each other, they've formed study groups with each other and they've started studying for exams and tests together. So, I mean, that's just like an unforeseen benefit of redirection, but it's still a good one.
I think another like
Sorry.
unforeseen
Yeah.
benefit of redirection is I've noticed like sometimes I'll go or I'll ask a question or a follow-up question. And if I, the original group doesn't know it and I redirect other students and they don't know it, if I redirect their notes and they don't have it, it's also important kind of, because in lecture, when you're in a class for an hour and 15 minutes, a lot of things can get missed in class, especially when it's just, lecture for a straight hour and 15 minutes. So also making sure that they have the things in their notes that are going to be important is also another benefit to redirection that I've noticed in session.
Madison, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna agree with Brett. That same thing happened to me where whenever I redirected my students to each other, they formed these study groups among themselves. And they even have like their own separate group chat and all going on. And then Kayla said the other thing I was gonna say about how like they get to like check their lecture notes and like make sure they because like if I redirect a student to their notes and they don't have it in there, then they can also talk to like their partners and then they're like, oh, hey, like I actually need this information. So in a way, it kind of helps them with their studying and stuff on their own too. That's why I think it's important.
I'll also add when you redirect to notes, I think that's another way of almost checking understanding as well. But like I think back to facilitating for math, like, I wouldn't always do like the same problems that we did in class, but I would do like similar problems or change up the numbers. So if they can take that similar problem and look at the processes, if they understand the processes, they'll be able to apply it to the problem presented to them. But if they're only if that's how you can kind of gauge where they're at, because if they can only look at that process and not transfer it to that problem, there's that like lack of understanding somewhere in there.
All right, so yeah, I think the most important thing here is just to remember that you're supposed to be more like a friend with your students and not their teacher. So I don't know about you, but whenever I'm helping my friends with something, I never give them the answers to anything, or I never I'm not direct with them because direct in answering, because I want to make sure that the next time they're presented with that scenario again, they can know how to handle themselves rather than relying on something else. So you want to make sure they can work through different things themselves. So like when you're redirecting them to something, you want to make sure that when they're studying by themselves at home, they know how to redirect themselves. So you're really just kind of like training them in session to be able to do that on their own and not be dependent. So how have you guys redirected your students during session?
one of my favorite ways to redirect my students is if they if I ask them like a check for understanding or question and they aren't exactly sure, they look like they're confused. I always do what's called, you want to phone a friend, and then they can, phone talk to another student in the session, and then hopefully they can help them.
Yeah, I love that one. And I think when you are presented with that scenario, I think it would be even more useful to first ask them what they know about it already before you can redirect them to their peers. But I mean, both ways is very useful, but like when you really help them understand what they already know, and then they can make those connections with what their peers are talking about, then they can really understand it fully. Anyone else?
I just want to ask, I know we probably need to move on, but I do want to ask, what is your first go-to redirection? If everybody just wants to kind of throw something in the chat, I'd like to take a poll of that. What's your go-to first redirection? I'm seeing peers and then notes. Some people start with notes, peers. Okay. Other students, yep. So lots of peers, lots of notes. All right. Who directs back to the student who might be confused or might be asking the question? Has anybody tried that? You can just raise your hand or say yes, turn on your mic. I'm not seeing anyone. So actually that is my favorite first go-to. It's really important to remember that in order for that student to get a check for understanding, that they are able to find their answer as well. So I think it's often really helpful, even before directing to other peers, to ask the student. Sarah already mentioned this earlier. I don't know if you caught that, it was a redirect, but asking that student back again, well, how much do you know? Okay, you say you don't know this, but tell me how much you know about this concept, or, how much do you know? And that actually makes them more confident because they realize, I know more than I think I do. So again, connecting those dots, as Laura was talking about, letting them explain the bigger picture can sometimes actually get them to their answer. And then having the peers, of course, kind of like teach back or whatever, make sure their check for understanding is strong as well. But it's really important to, if you are directing to a peer or a resource, that you do always come back to that student too. But it's really important to also build their confidence in seeing what they do know.
Yeah, and a point that I think is just really important with all of the elements is the goal of any facilitation strategy, which is what you're doing, like what we're doing in sessions. The goal is to make our students independent learners. And I know that that's kind of weird because we focus on collaborative learning and collaborative learning is so important. But the overall goal, the ultimate goal, is to make our students independent learners so that they don't need us, so that they can take the material that they've learned in session, they can take the strategies that they've learned in session and then go home and apply it to the rest of their notes. Y'all know we can't cover everything. It is not your job as facilitators to cover everything that they need to know for the test or in the class. So they need to be able to go home or form their own study groups and be able to do these things without you. And that's the goal for session period. So while we do focus on collaborative learning, we also really, the ultimate goal is making them independent learners. That's where the transferable study skills come in. They can use these strategies in their other classes where they don't have SI, or even in their later classes when they get up into their major and they don't have SI. We are teaching them how to be better learners just overall. And so just every single one of these elements is supporting that. And redirection, I think, is a really important one in that. In that process, is letting them know, like, I have everything that I need in front of me to learn this information. I don't need other people, like anyone else. I have what I need, or I know how to get it. And so that's the whole point.
Yeah, so something Emily said yesterday was when you redirect your students, in the end, you can really help them feel more proud, and so that they're not like feeling, oh, I didn't know the answer to this on my own. But then when you're redirecting them, you're helping them figure it out on their own. They can say, oh, I did this myself at the end. Even if they did it with your help, it's still, they did it themselves regardless. And then I think Oscar was talking about the follow-up questions yesterday. When you redirect by using follow-up questions, you can also check for their understanding as you're redirecting, which is very important. So the next element is wait time. And I think this is one that I neglect the most, but I think it is very useful. And after talking about it yesterday, I think I will incorporate this a lot more than I already do. So wait time can be divided into two. So wait time one is ask a question after a question is asked, and then wait time two is after a question is answered. We really just apply wait time to give them the time to think about the question they asked and maybe answer it themselves, because once we say something out loud, we can understand it better, and maybe they can take that time to redirect themselves, or the students can talk while you're giving them that wait time. But I'm really just gonna ask you guys why you think wait time is important.
I think wait time is important because they need to learn to not second guess themselves or look for confirmation on what they know when they're taking the test, because they need to know like right away if they're right or wrong. And if they sit there questioning themselves, then they're going to waste a lot of time on the exam, and we're not helping them be good students if we answer them right away.
Also, going off of that, you can tell how like confident they are when like in their answer just based on wait time, because the students that say their answer and then like while you're doing wait time, they're like, that's my final answer, like that's what I'm sticking with. But then some students you have, like when you're doing wait time, they go, wait, hold up, maybe it's something else. So you can just gauge their confidence and how well that they know the material from like wait time too.
I also think wait time is a way to be inclusive, and we always want to be inclusive to our students and not exclude, even unintentionally. So when we're waiting, we're allowing for different types of learners also to have an opportunity to process and provide input. Because if one student answers and so this is obviously right, wait time too, and we confirm or deny, we're robbing the students in the session the opportunity to add more to it, or to disagree or agree and explain their reasoning as to why that answer is correct. It puts us in the expert role when we are confirming and denying. So I suggest always having other students confirm and deny the responses that are given. And then when a question is asked and there's wait time, a question is asked by anyone in the group, not just the facilitator, just allowing that time to process is key. Because again, there are different learners. And Valerie, I know you shared that really great story yesterday that like in class, when a professor just asks a question, you know, you're thinking about it, you want to answer, well, you weren't given enough time to do so. So it's really important to be inclusive.
And yesterday, Valerie also talked about how wait time is a really good practice for like real world scenarios when you're talking to other people. It goes along with those listening skills, and it's just very important to apply. Just so you can better answer people's questions in real life as well. All right, so do you guys have any tips on applying wait time or things that you find very useful so that it's not awkward or that you can just do it more efficiently, make better use?
Something I do is like maybe flip through my notes, kind of acting like I'm trying to find the answer. It's just less awkward that way because it looks like I'm doing something while they're, you know, that awkward moment in between. So yeah.
I play music in the background of mine, like of my sessions. And I feel like that helps a lot because there's no like awkward silence.
Honestly, I think if you're willing to embrace the awkward moments, the students feel pressured really fast and they'll usually answer you before the 15 seconds are over. So that's what I did.
Honestly, something, oh, sorry.
You
I was
go.
gonna say, something that I'll do is if it's like, you know, a question was asked, I'll think through like how I would respond to that question. Or if like an answer is said, like I'll be thinking about like, all right, how do I want to respond? Like, you know, like that, like think before you speak almost, like just thinking through what you want to say first before just initially jumping in to speak.
I was just going to add that I like to look at the rest of the students in session just to make sure they are feeling included and to see how they're feeling about what we're talking about, because you can easily tell by the way a student either looks confused by what we're discussing or if they're like looking through their notes and I know I can call on them next and then maybe they know more or they would like to add more. I do also want to add, I feel like this is something I struggle with, but I don't see the barrier for me here is not that I feel awkward. It's more so that I'm like very much just invested. I'm like, I get impatient that I want to ask them a checks for understanding question, which is why I think my checks for understanding outweighs my wait time because I'm always so focused on like being engaged with my students. And I never make sure or I do, but not as much as I would like to. I don't give them that wait time for them to understand the question. I just ask them, I'm like, oh, I just follow it up with another question sometimes. And that's where I would say I fall short.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Laraib, because that is, I think, something I mentioned yesterday too, is, and we see this a lot, you're not the only one that does a lot of follow-up questions, and we want to warn you against filling the silence with just more questions, because you're piling, even if you think that those questions might be getting them to the answer, again, as Oscar said yesterday, it puts you in the expert role. You're the one who knows the questions to ask. You're the one that's getting there. So how can instead you give them moments to process, you give them a chance to redirect themselves, or you end up redirecting themselves after you have waited. And then, you know, they can find, then you can ask more follow-up questions as a check for understanding once they find their answers, of course, but you want to be wary of filling in the silence with extra questions. It's just piling it on them when you're definitely not going to be there to do that when they need to recall that information for any reason. Or is it really helping them put this stuff into their long-term memory? Because they will remember it more if it took them a minute to get to the answer. That's how our brains function too. So they will remember something that they had difficulty remembering in the beginning.
Yeah, and with checks for understanding coming into that, that's how we that kind of just builds on to the each element is important for the other two elements. So if you guys want to continue talking about that, we can.
Laraib, if it's okay with you, could we do like a quick 3, 2, 1 to have everybody kind of like solidify the information today? And because one of our questions that Oscar and I were thinking about was actually about how to use them together. But I'd love to hear if anybody has any things they want to throw out here for how to connect the 3 elements. Someone who hasn't spoken in biweekly or participated yet, share either a takeaway, something you'll incorporate, or how to connect the 3 elements.
Do you just mean connect as in like use the elements together, or? Yeah, so I guess one way is if a student asks a question, you can do wait time when they ask the question and then redirect them to, you know, whatever you like to redirect them to. I typically would do peers first.
One thing for me is like I would always struggle with checks for understanding, like asking those yes or no questions. So I feel like this presentation kind of like helps me come up with different checks for understandings, like connecting the big picture, that sort of thing. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation.
One way that I like to kind of incorporate all 3 of the elements, like starting with checks for understanding, so like asking that question, and then like using wait time too, of course. I find that my students oftentimes, if they don't know the answer or they want that like instant gratification, it's almost like I don't have to redirect because they redirect themselves, which is something that I love to see. They've kind of picked up on like the habits or like what I'm going to say to them, like, okay, take your notes and see if you're right, or you know, ask your friend if they got the same thing. So I really love to see that.
The one takeaway I got was that what Oscar mentioned is that when they ask the question, you start using the wait time and you think of how you would answer the question. I think that's really good.
All right, so yeah, those were some very great points. I know I already talked about it during checks for understanding, but I really do think that's like the most efficient way to escalate each element is to incorporate the other two elements. For example, when you're redirecting, you can't redirect without first using that wait time to see how the students are feeling about it, and then maybe redirect them either to notes if they kind of get it, or you might even want to resort to Google if you feel like they're not going to be able to answer the question. And Google would be for things like questions that weren't answered in general, like even in their PowerPoint or like their notes. But yeah, and then redirection in itself is also a sort of checks for understanding.
I love it. Thank you so much, Laraib, for putting this together and being such a good example for all of us. So thank you. Now you all know also you have a person on the team you can directly go to who has a lot of advice on this. And sorry, Laraib, I'm not trying to give you more work, but yeah, so make sure you do this 3-2-1 on your own if you haven't already written it down. Make sure to incorporate some of these things next week that you've learned, some new ideas on all the 3 elements. And remember, you can't use one without the others. So have a good weekend, everyone.
Admin, can one or any of y'all stay back for just like 1 minute?
Yeah,
I got to run, but I think Emily or Sarah should be able to.
Oscar, I'll be at the meeting in a moment.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
gonna
it's just
run
a
to the
super
bathroom real
simple
quick,
question.
so
yeah,
I don't think we're gonna start on time anyway, but I'm gonna leave without ending the meeting today. That is my goal.
Okay.
Yeah, I just have a question. If I want to send an email to like the whole team, it's just for the Secret Santa thing. I can do that through UNG Connect, right? Is that the best way to do that?
Yeah, Emily, stop recording.
Oh, sorry. Let me see if I can figure that out.